The first time I saw it, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The storm had rolled in fast, the kind that floods streets and cuts out power in an instant. I was sitting at the window of my rented room, the old Victorian house creaking under the weight of the relentless wind. The rain streaked down the glass like tiny rivers, obscuring my view of the overgrown yard below. Then, through the torrents of rain and flashes of lightning, I noticed something move. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, a fleeting shadow that rippled unnaturally, independent of the trees swaying violently outside. But it lingered. Each time the lightning illuminated the yard, the shadow seemed closer, darker, denser. I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat as if something unseen pressed its weight against my chest. My fingers gripped the windowsill so hard that the splintered wood bit into my skin. The air in the room grew heavy, almost suffocating, as the storm outside raged louder. The shadow finally stopped, just beneath the large oak tree in the yard, a black mass that seemed to suck the light from its surroundings. My pulse pounded in my ears. Even as the thunder roared, I could swear I heard whispers, faint and incoherent, threading through the noise. I blinked, and in that fraction of a second, it shifted again. It wasn't under the tree anymore. It was directly at the edge of the house, just beyond the porch. My body screamed at me to run, to hide, but I couldn't tear myself away from the window. My eyes locked on the black void as it began to twist and stretch, shapes forming within it like skeletal hands clawing their way into existence. The whispers grew louder. They weren't incoherent anymore. They were calling my name. I stumbled back from the window, knocking over the small table behind me. The crash startled me into action. I turned on every light in the room, though the bulbs flickered, struggling against some unseen force. My breathing was shallow and erratic, and my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. The storm's fury didn't let up, but the house fell unnaturally silent. The usual creaks of the floorboards and groans of the old walls were gone. Even the wind seemed muted, replaced by a steady, deliberate tapping. The sound came from downstairs. I froze, listening as the tapping turned to a scraping, as if something sharp was dragging itself across the wooden floor. My feet moved before I could think, each step feeling like wading through water. I reached the landing, peering down the dark staircase. The faint glow of a street lamp outside flickered through the stained glass window, casting distorted patterns on the walls. At the base of the stairs, the front door stood ajar. The lock dangled loosely, as if it had been wrenched apart. A cold draught whispered through the house, carrying with it a metallic scent that made my stomach churn. Something wet glistened on the floorboards, trailing toward the open door. I didn't want to follow it. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but the whispers, now clearer, louder, pulled me forward. I stepped down, the old steps creaking louder than usual beneath my weight. As I reached the bottom, I saw it more clearly. A dark, viscous trails smeared across the wood, leading outside into the rain. Lightning lit up the porch for a brief moment, and my heart stopped. Standing in the yard, right where the shadow had been, was a figure. Its form was tall and impossibly thin. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Its limbs twitched and convulsed, as if struggling to hold their shape. It wasn't human. Yuma, Tumil. I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I threw the deadbolt and backed away. The whispers didn't stop. Erlen, they were inside my head now, crawling through my thoughts like worms burrowing into soft earth. The lights in the house flickered violently, and the walls groaned as if the house itself was alive. Shadows danced across the room, but I couldn't tell where they were coming from. I stumbled back into the corner, my breath ragged, as the whispers coalesced into one word, repeated over and over. Come. And then silence. The storm was gone. The whispers vanished. The house was still again. But the air carried the weight of something unnatural. My heart pounded in the suffocating quiet, and I dared to glance back at the door. The trail of blackened liquid was gone. The door was locked, but the shadows in the corner of the room still writhed. I wasn't alone. Nay, the stillness in the house was unbearable, the kind that digs into your bones and sets your nerves on edge. My ears strained against the silence, desperate for anything to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. But the longer I stood there, the more the quiet pressed down, suffocating and endless. The shadows in the corner didn't move, at least not in the way you'd expect. They pulsed, expanding and contracting as if breathing. I clenched my fists, nails biting into my palms as I fought the instinct to run. My legs felt anchored to the floor, unwilling to risk provoking whatever had claimed this space as its own. A low hum vibrated through the walls, faint at first, but growing steadily louder. It wasn't coming from a single direction. It surrounded me, reverberating through the air, rattling the glass fixtures overhead. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the sound drilled into my skull, unrelenting. And then, as abruptly as it started, it stopped. My ears rang in the absence, the quiet, now deafening in its intensity. I forced myself to move, inching toward the light switch. The dim overhead bulb flickered erratically, casting long, warped shadows across the room. My fingers brushed against the switch, but I didn't flip it. Something about the shadows felt wrong. Some of the shadows felt wrong. They didn't align with the furniture or the angles of the walls. They had their own geometry, twisting in ways that defied logic. A sudden chill swept through the room, raising goosebumps along my arm. The whispers returned, soft and coaxing, threading through the air like a melody just out of reach. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were speaking, no, commanding. Follow. The word was sharp, each syllable cutting through the haze of fear that clouded my mind. My heart raced, my body trembling as an unseen force seemed to tug me toward the staircase. It was like being caught in a current, the pull irresistible, even as every instinct screamed to resist. I gripped the banister, the wood cold and slick beneath my palm, and forced myself to look up. The staircase was shrouded in darkness. The faint glow of the upstairs light swallowed entirely. A faint, acrid smell drifted down, burning my nose and making my stomach churn. It was the stench of decay, of something long dead and left to fester. One step. Wah. Two. Tactile. Then another. The stairs creaked under my weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. I reached the top, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The hallway stretched before me, impossibly long. The doors on either side cracked open just enough to reveal the inky blackness beyond. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They came from the farthest room, the one I hadn't entered since moving in. The door was ajar, swinging gently on its hinges, as if beckoning me forward. My feet moved on their own, the floorboards groaning beneath each step. The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting until each exhale clouded before me. The smell was stronger now, almost overpowering, and I had to fight the urge to gag. I reached the door and hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to stretch infinitely. I pushed the door open, the hinges screaming in protest. The room was empty. At least, that's what I thought at first. The faint moonlight streaming through the window revealed a figure standing in the far corner. Its back to me. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its proportions were exaggerated, limbs too long and thin, its head tilting unnaturally to one side. The skin, or whatever covered it, was pale and translucent, the outlines of bones visible beneath. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My eyes stayed locked on the figure, but it didn't turn. Instead, it raised one spindly arm, pointing to something on the wall. A mirror. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't me. The eyes were black pits, the face gaunt and twisted into a mockery of my own. It moved independently, its lips curling into a grin that stretched impossibly wide. I stumbled back, the room spinning as a wave of nausea crashed over me. When I looked again, the mirror was gone, the figure with it, but the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into complete darkness. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping until they were a cacophony of sound. They weren't words anymore, just noise, raw and grating. A physical weight pressing against my chest. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the floor, my hands clawing at the air, desperate for escape. The darkness pulsed, swallowing me whole. And then there was nothing. The oppressive darkness didn't just envelop me. It seeped into my skin, pressing against my ribs, squeezing my lungs until I felt like I was breathing underwater. My chest ached with every shallow inhale, my mind spinning as though it couldn't find purchase in reality. Somewhere in the void, the whispers took shape again. They weren't distant anymore. They were inside my head, burrowing into the deepest recesses of my thoughts. It was like they knew me, my fears, my guilt, the secrets I had never confessed. Every word they spoke was a serrated blade, slicing into my resolve. The cold was unbearable now, an icy grip clawing up my spine, settling in my limbs. My hands moved, not of my own volition, but guided by something unseen. My fingers stretched out into the void, desperate for something tangible, something to anchor me in this suffocating nothingness. Then, like a sudden inhalation, the darkness recoiled, peeling away to reveal the room again, or what was left of it. The furniture was splintered, the walls warped, as if the space itself had been contorted. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoed from the far corner, a sound so sharp it felt like needles pricking my ears. I turned, and there it was, the figure from before. Only now, it wasn't still. Its head moved in small, jerking motions, swiveling as though searching for something. Its arms hung at unnatural angles, fingers twitching like they were pulling invisible strings. But its face was mine, not the distorted reflection from earlier, but an exact replica, a cruel mimicry that froze me in place. It smiled, the gesture deliberate, as if savoring my horror. The tapping grew louder, more erratic, until it was a violent staccato that vibrated through the walls. My vision blurred, spots dancing in the corners of my eyes. And then it lunged. The air left my lungs in a strangled cry, as its hands gripped my shoulders, pinning me to the warped floor. Its weight was suffocating, its touch burning cold. I fought, every instinct screaming to get away. But its strength was inhuman, overwhelming. Its face was inches from mine, its breath icy and reeking of rot. "You'll understand soon," it hissed, its voice layered and distorted, each word dripping with malice. The words didn't pass its lips. They seemed to come from everywhere, vibrating in my chest, rattling my teeth. The room twisted again, the walls folding inward, the floor undulating beneath me. My screams were swallowed by the void, my body suspended in a weightless freefall. And then I was somewhere else. The sharp smell of wet earth filled my nostrils, and I realized I was lying in a shallow grave. Dirt clung to my skin, damp and suffocating. Overhead the sky was wrong, a swirling mass of crimson and black, punctuated by jagged lightning that illuminated grotesque shapes in the distance. Figures moved in the shadows, hunched and skittering, their forms too blurred to discern, but their intent unmistakable. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding so violently it felt like it would burst from my chest. The ground beneath me pulsed, as though it was alive, and each step I took was met with resistance, as if the earth itself was reluctant to let me go. The figures in the distance were closer now, their shapes solidifying into something almost human, but not quite. Their limbs were elongated, their heads twisted at impossible angles. They moved with a predatory grace, circling, their glowing eyes fixed on me. A high-pitched scream cut through the air, but it wasn't mine. One of the figures broke from the circle, crawling toward me with a speed that defied logic. My legs moved before I could think, adrenaline surging through my veins as I ran blindly into the suffocating red haze. The landscape stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of jagged rocks and blackened trees that seemed to close in the further I went. The whispers were back, louder now, their tone mocking and cruel. They called my name over and over, taunting me with snippets of my own voice, twisted and warped. I stumbled, my knees hitting the ground hard. The impact jolted me, and for a moment the whispers stopped. The air was thick, every breath a struggle, but I forced myself to look up. Ahead there was a clearing, bathed in an eerie silver light that felt out of place in this nightmare. In the center of the clearing stood a mirror, tall and ornate, its surface unnaturally smooth. The sight of it made my stomach churn. I knew better than to approach it, every instinct screaming that it was a trap. But something compelled me forward, an invisible thread, pulling me closer. As I stepped into the clearing, the whispers returned, frantic now, overlapping in a chaotic cacophony. My reflection appeared in the mirror, but this time it didn't mimic me. It stared back with hollow eyes, its mouth moving silently, forming words I couldn't hear. I reached out, my hand trembling as it hovered inches from the glass. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar, and then, with a sharp crack, the mirror shattered. The shards didn't fall. They hung suspended in the air, spinning and glinting in the pale light. Each fragment reflected a different version of me, all distorted and grotesque. One by one, they began to move, their jagged edges slicing through the air as they closed in. And then, the pain began. The shards didn't cut, they burrowed. Each fragment slammed into me, embedding itself deep within my skin. The agony was indescribable, a searing electric fire that pulsed through every nerve in my body. My screams tore through the thick, oppressive air, but they seemed to be absorbed by the void, swallowed before they could reach my ears. As the last piece lodged itself into my chest, the world around me collapsed. Colors bled into one another, the crimson sky dripping down like paint washing away, leaving behind a void so vast and silent it felt alive. My knees buckled, and I fell into the nothingness, the weight of the shards pressing down on me, each one pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. It wasn't just my body that they invaded. Memories I didn't recognize began flashing before my eyes, places I'd never been, faces I'd never seen. Yet they felt intimately familiar, like pieces of a life I had somehow lived, but couldn't remember. I saw myself standing in a room, bathed in cold, fluorescent light, my hands slick with something dark and warm. There was a voice, pleading, begging, but it was faint, as if muffled by water. Then, silence. I tried to push the visions away, clawing at my head, but they only intensified. The fragments within me seemed to hum with delight, their jagged edges twisting deeper with every second. Want. The more I resisted, the more vivid the images became, until they consumed me entirely. When the void released me, I found myself back in the clearing. The mirror was whole again, but its surface was no longer smooth. It rippled like water, and my reflection stared back with an expression that wasn't my own. It smiled, a wide, predatory grin that stretched too far, exposing rows of teeth that didn't belong in a human mouth. "You can't fight it," my reflection said, though its lips didn't move. The words came from everywhere, nowhere, echoing inside my skull. "You are mine. Now." I stumbled backward, my body heavy and unresponsive. The ground beneath me cracked, and black tendrils began to emerge, writhing and snaking toward me. They coiled around my ankles, cold and slimy, pulling me toward the mirror. I struggled, digging my fingers into the dirt, but the earth crumbled beneath my touch, offering no resistance. The mirror pulsed with light, its surface shifting to reveal scenes that weren't mine, but could have been. A figure stood in my place, their face obscured, their actions horrifyingly familiar. They moved through the world like a shadow, leaving destruction in their wake. People screamed, their faces twisted in terror as they turned to ash beneath the figure's touch. "No," I whispered, shaking my head violently. "That's not me. That's not me." The mirror rippled again, and the figure turned. For the briefest moment, their face was clear. It was mine. A jolt of electricity shot through me, and I was pulled into the mirror. The world warped and twisted. My screams, lost in the cacophony of cracking glass and shifting reality. When the chaos subsided, I was standing in a room I recognized all too well. The cold, fluorescent lit space from the vision, the metallic smell of blood filled the air, and the walls were lined with jagged mirrors, each reflecting a different version of me. One sobbed uncontrollably, their face streaked with tears. Another laughed maniacally, their mouth twisted into an unhinged grin. Others stared blankly, their hollow eyes filled with a deep, unrelenting despair. The soft, rhythmic tapping drew my attention to the far corner of the room. There, hunched over a figure sprawled on the floor, was the thing from before. Its movements were slow and deliberate, its long fingers dripping with a dark, viscous liquid. It turned to face me, and for the first time I saw its eyes. Empty sockets that seemed to pierce through me, searching for something it had already found. "You've finally arrived," it rasped, its voice a low, guttural growl that resonated in my chest. "Now you will see." Senwai, The figure on the floor moved, their head tilting toward me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they weren't a stranger. It was me, every detail identical, down to the scar on my left hand. But their eyes were different, filled with a terror so profound it made my knees buckle. The creature stepped aside, gesturing toward the me on the floor. And if you acted, the truth lies within. Embrace it, or be consumed. I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but my legs wouldn't move. The walls seemed to close in, the mirrors warping and distorting, their surfaces filled with the grotesque versions of myself. The whispers returned, louder now, their words sharp and cruel, their meaning clear. This was my fate. There was no escape. And as the creature moved closer, its hands outstretched, I realized with chilling certainty that I was already too far gone. The air in the room thickened as the creature loomed closer, its skeletal fingers outstretched. My twin on the floor writhed, their face frozen in an expression of pure agony. I could hear their shallow, labored breaths, each one rattling like a death knell. My pulse pounded in my ears, the rhythm erratic, almost drowning out the whispers growing louder in my mind. I tried to back away, but the floor beneath me wasn't solid anymore. It pulsed and shifted like molten glass, swallowing my footsteps and trapping me in place. My arms felt like lead, my breath short and panicked. Every nerve screamed at me to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The creature didn't walk. It glided, its movements unnatural, defying physics. It bent its long, gaunt form, its empty sockets aligning with my gaze. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence, so complete it felt alive, pressing against my ears, my lungs, my very thoughts. Then it spoke, and the sound was like shards of ice scraping against bone. See. With that single word, it plunged its fingers into my chest. The sensation wasn't sharp or painful. It was hollow, an emptiness that spread through me like ink in water. My vision blurred, and the room melted away, replaced by an endless void. But this wasn't the nothingness I'd fallen into before. This was worse. Images flooded my mind, fragments of memories I didn't own. A house, its walls lined with faded photographs, a woman's laugh, soft and melodic, echoing down a hallway. The laughter turned to screams, piercing and raw, as the hallway darkened and the walls began to bleed. Shadows moved, and I saw myself standing at the end of the corridor, my hands drenched in crimson. The whispers returned, louder, a cacophony of voices, each one accusing, condemning. I tried to deny it, shaking my head violently, but the scene shifted, and I was no longer a passive observer. I was there, holding something heavy and sharp, its edge glinting with a wicked sheen. A figure lay at my feet, motionless, their blood pooling around me. My hands moved without my consent, raising the weapon again. and I felt the resistance as it met flesh. Stop. I screamed, but my voice was a whisper lost in the storm. The creature's voice slithered into my mind, coiling around my thoughts. You cannot escape what you are. The void shifted again, and I was back in the room, gasping for air. The creature had retreated, its form blending into the shadows, but its presence lingered, heavy and suffocating. My twin was gone, replaced by a mirror. Its surface was cracked and distorted, reflecting dozens of versions of me, each one more twisted and grotesque than the last. Their eyes bore into me, filled with hatred, sorrow, and something else, anticipation. The whispers crescendoed, and the cracks in the mirror widened, spilling thick, dark liquid onto the floor. The substance oozed toward me, its tendrils reaching, wrapping around my ankles. I struggled, but the more I moved, the tighter it held. It climbed higher, cold and sticky, until it reached my chest, constricting my breath. Then, as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The liquid receded, the whispers fell silent, and the mirror shimmered, its surface smooth once more. But my reflection wasn't me. It was the creature. It grinned, its sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. You see now, don't you? It said, its voice my own. You were always one of us. The floor beneath me shattered, and I fell. The sensation of endless descent gripping me once more. My screams echoed into the void, unanswered, as the creature's laughter followed me, a haunting melody that promised there was no end to this nightmare. The fall felt endless, the darkness consuming me from all sides. The air around me was cold, but not the natural chill of winter. It was hollow, like the absence of life itself. My limbs were weightless, as if my body no longer obeyed the laws of gravity. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional echo of my own terrified breaths. When I finally hit the ground, it wasn't with the expected impact. Instead, I landed softly, the surface beneath me pliable and unnervingly warm. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat, and the texture reminded me of skin. I scrambled to my feet, trying to steady my breathing, but the surface squirmed underfoot, almost as if it was alive. As my eyes adjusted to the faint, otherworldly glow that emanated from nowhere and everywhere, I realized I was in a cavern. The walls were slick, undulating as if they were breathing. Strange, pulsating veins ran through them, glowing faintly with an ominous red hue. The air was thick and humid, carrying the metallic tang of blood. A faint hum filled the cavern, low and rhythmic, a sound that settled deep into my bones and made my teeth ache. Ahead of me, the cavern narrowed into a tunnel. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But when I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing, only the void I had fallen through. The tunnel seemed like the only way forward, though the idea of walking deeper into this hellish place churned my stomach. but the ground beneath me began to ripple, urging me toward the tunnel, and I realized I had no choice. Each step into the tunnel was a battle against the oppressive atmosphere. Eindoners. The walls closed in around me, the glowing veins casting eerie shadows that danced and twisted like spectral figures. The hum grew louder, almost melodic, though it carried a dissonance that made my skin crawl. My heartbeat matched its rhythm, each thud reverberating in my ears. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a massive chamber, and I froze. The center of the chamber was dominated by an enormous, grotesque structure. It looked like a throne, but it was formed entirely of writhing, blackened tendrils, each one twisting and pulsing as though alive. Seated on the throne was a figure. No, a shape. It was vaguely human, but grotesquely distorted. Its limbs were elongated and thin, its face obscured by a veil of shadows. Its presence was overwhelming, a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. It raised its head, and though its face was hidden, I felt its gaze pierce through me. The hum in the air stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical force. Then it spoke, not with words, but directly into my mind. "Welcome," it intoned, its voice deep and resonant, dripping with malice. "You have come far, and now you stand before the truth." I shook my head, backing away instinctively, but my feet wouldn't move. The floor beneath me had hardened, trapping me in place. My mouth opened to protest, to scream, but no sound came out. "You have seen glimpses," it continued, rising from the throne. Its movements were fluid, almost serpentine, as it descended the steps toward me. "But now you will know." The walls of the chamber began to writhe, and faces emerged from their surface. Familiar faces. My own. My own. They stared at me with hollow, accusing eyes, their mouths contorted in silent screams. The veins running through the walls pulsed violently, and a low, guttural moan filled the chamber. The figure stopped inches from me, towering over me. Its form shimmered, and for a moment I saw myself reflected in its shadow. My own face, twisted and grotesque, stared back at me. Its hand, if it could be called that, reached out, and I was powerless to stop it. When it touched my chest, a searing pain shot through me, and I felt something pull free. A part of me, my soul, my essence, I didn't know, was ripped away, leaving behind a void so vast it consumed me. I crumpled to my knees, gasping, as the figure held the glowing fragment of myself. "This is your truth," it said, its voice reverberating through the chamber. "You are not the hunter. You are the prey, and this is your penance." The fragment dissolved into its hand, and the chamber erupted in chaos. The faces in the walls screamed, their cries deafening as the ground beneath me cracked and splintered. The figure's laughter echoed through the chaos, a sound so cold and cruel it sent shivers through my entire being. Then the ground gave way, and I fell again, the darkness swallowing me whole. The sensation of falling ended abruptly, but I didn't land this time. Instead, I found myself suspended in a vast, infinite void. There was no ground beneath me, no walls, no light, only an overwhelming darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. My body hung weightless, like a marionette cut loose from its strings, yet I could still feel the faint remnants of the searing pain in my chest, where the figure had taken something vital from me. I tried to scream, to force any sound out of my throat, but it was as if the void itself devoured every noise, every thought, before it could form. My mind was unraveling, fragments of memories, flashing before my eyes like a distorted film, real. I saw faces, places, moments I couldn't place, things that were mine yet felt foreign, corrupted. And then, like a crack splitting through glass, a sliver of light tore through the darkness. It was blinding, jagged, and unnatural, cutting through the void with a precision that made my skin crawl. The light widened, and from within it emerged something. The shape was indistinct at first, shifting and contorting, as if it couldn't decide on a form. But as it moved closer, the outlines sharpened, and I realized it was mirroring me. It stood as my exact replica. Though its presence was heavier, its movements smoother, more deliberate. Its eyes, however, were empty voids, darker than the space surrounding us. "You thought you could escape this," it said, its voice a distorted version of my own. It wasn't speaking aloud, but the words vibrated within my skull, resonating with the very core of my being. "You thought you could resist." I tried to speak, but again, nothing came out. The entity tilted its head, almost mockingly, and took a step closer. With every movement it made, the void seemed to ripple, as though it were bending to its will. "You've always been running," it continued, circling me now. "But this is where the path ends." It reached out a hand, my hand, and pressed it to my chest. Instantly, an overwhelming cold spread through my body, freezing every nerve, every thought. I wanted to recoil, but I was paralyzed. The void around us began to shift, scenes and shapes forming like ripples on the surface of water. I saw myself. Moments I recognized, but wished I could forget. The shadows of decisions I had buried deep. The weight of guilt I had refused to confront. The void projected them all, twisting them into grotesque exaggerations, magnifying my failures until they were too vast to ignore. "No," I finally croaked, my voice cracking under the pressure. "This isn't real." The entity laughed, a hollow, chilling sound that reverberated through the void. "It's as real as you've made it," it said. "Every choice, every lie, every shadow you fed has brought you here." The scenes around us grew darker, more violent. I saw myself turning away from people I had loved, walking into situations I knew would destroy me. I watched as I reached out for things I could never grasp, only to fall deeper into the abyss each time. "This isn't me," I screamed, finding my voice at last. "Engabigabi," but the sound echoed endlessly, but the entity didn't flinch. Its empty gaze bore into me, unyielding. "It is you," it said simply, "and it always will be." The cold in my chest deepened, and I felt as though I was being consumed from the inside out. The entity stepped even closer until our faces were inches apart. I could see the void swirling within its eyes, and for a moment I saw something else, something darker, deeper, endless. "This is your truth," it whispered, "and there is no escape." The void around us collapsed, swallowing the images, the light, and the entity itself. I was left alone, suspended in the infinite darkness. For a moment, I thought it was over, that I was finally free of whatever nightmare had ensnared me. But then, the darkness began to move. It wasn't empty anymore. Shapes and forms swirled around me, creatures born of shadow and malice. They had no faces, no distinct features, but their presence was suffocating. They circled me, closing in, their whispers growing louder and louder until they were a deafening roar. I tried to fight, to scream, to run, but there was no escape. The void consumed everything, including the last remnants of myself. The sun hung low, casting a blood-red glow over the crumbling facades of the buildings. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of our car engine as we rolled into the deserted town. Every instinct told me to keep driving, but the gas gauge had dipped below empty miles ago. There was no cell service, no sign of life. Just endless stretches of cracked asphalt leading us to this place that seemed plucked from another era. The sign at the entrance read, "Welcome to Hollow Junction." Its once bright lettering was chipped, the paint curling like dead skin. The air carried an odd metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat, almost like the taste of blood. The others, Jake, Kelly, and Sandra, didn't seem to notice, or maybe they were too focused on their phones, futilely waving them in the air, searching for a signal. Jake pulled the car to a stop near what looked like an old general store. Its windows were caked with grime, obscuring whatever might have been inside. The door hung ajar, creaking softly in the still air. "We'll check for gas," he muttered, more to himself than us. I didn't argue. Something about the place made me hesitant to speak too loudly, as if the walls themselves were listening. The store was dark, the air stale and heavy, with the scent of mildew. Rows of shelves stood in disarray, their contents long looted or decayed. Dust coated every surface, disturbed only by faint tracks leading toward the back of the store. "Hello?" Jake called out, his voice breaking the quiet like a gunshot. No answer came, just the hollow echo of his words bouncing off the walls. We moved deeper inside. We moved deeper inside. At the far end of the store was a counter with an old cash register perched precariously on top. Beside it lay a faded notebook, its cover worn and stained. Sandra picked it up, flipping through the pages with a frown. "It's just scribbles," she said, showing us jagged lines and symbols etched in black ink. They weren't random, though. They had a pattern, a rhythm that drew the eye, making it hard to look away. A loud crash shattered the silence, sending all of us spinning toward the source. A metal shelf had toppled over, its contents spilling across the floor. But there was no one else here. Kelly laughed nervously, her voice trembling. "It's just the wind," she said, though we all knew there hadn't been so much as a breeze since we'd arrived. Outside, the fading sunlight painted the town in deep shadows. We decided to split up, searching for anything useful, gas, food, or a phone that worked. As I wandered down the main street, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Envelop were dull, or no longer down. Windows stared down at me like empty eye sockets, and every step seemed to echo louder than the last. At the end of the street stood a church, its steeple piercing the darkening sky. Something about it drew me in, an inexplicable pull that made my feet move despite the pit forming in my stomach. The wooden doors were carved with intricate symbols, their meanings as alien as the ones in the notebook. I pushed them open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick and oppressive. Pews sat in neat rows, their surfaces scratched and worn. The altar at the front held a single object, a stone bowl filled with a dark, viscous liquid. The walls were lined with candles, their flames flickering, though there was no breeze. I stepped closer, my gaze drawn to the liquid's surface. "Of these and all, in bitter tide," it shimmered faintly, reflecting not the dim interior of the church, but something else entirely. A shifting landscape of shadows and teeth. A sharp pain shot through my hand. I looked down to see a thin red line running across my palm, blood welling up as if an invisible blade had cut me. Panic surged, and I stumbled backward, knocking over one of the pews. The sound reverberated through the church like thunder, and the candles extinguished all at once, plunging the room into darkness. I ran, bursting out into the night air, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The others were waiting for me outside, their faces pale and drawn. "Something's wrong here," I managed to choke out. They didn't question me. Jake pointed to a building nearby. The inn. Its sign swung gently in the still air, the word vacancy barely visible beneath years of grime. We hurried inside, barricading the door behind us. The inn was just as abandoned as the rest of the town, but it felt safer than being out in the open. We found rooms on the second floor, each more decrepit than the last. The wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing dark stains underneath. The beds were covered in a thick layer of dust, and the mirrors were cracked, their surfaces warped. That night, the sounds began, faint at first, scratching at the windows, whispers just out of earshot. Then came the footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving through the hallway outside our rooms. I lay frozen in bed, every muscle tense, listening as they stopped outside my door. The handle turned slowly, the creak of the hinges louder than a scream. And then, silence. The night pressed in around me, a suffocating shroud of silence and dread. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared at the door, its handle still trembling slightly from the unseen force that had turned it moments ago. I couldn't move. I couldn't move. Every instinct screamed to run, to escape, but my body betrayed me, paralyzed by a terror I couldn't name. The shadows in the room seemed to lengthen, creeping across the floor toward me, their edges jagged and alive. Somewhere down the hall, a door slammed, the sound reverberating through the decaying inn like the toll of a bell. It jolted me into motion. I scrambled out of bed, my bare feet hitting the warped wooden floor. The air was colder now, biting against my skin. My breath fogged in the dim light, filtering through the broken window. Isiu, Famnie. I opened the door, peering into the hallway. The shadows pulled thicker here, as if the darkness was gathering strength. Jake's room was just a few doors down. Hey. I moved toward it cautiously, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight. Each step felt like walking a tightrope stretched over an abyss. And you had sound. The door to Jake's room was ajar, swinging slightly, as if it had been recently disturbed. Jake, I whispered, my voice barely audible. No response. The silence pressed harder against my ears. So absolute it seemed to have a weight of its own. I pushed the door open. The room was empty, the bed untouched. His backpack lay on the floor, its contents spilled out as if he'd left in a hurry. A faint smell lingered in the air, metallic and sharp. Blood. My stomach churned as I followed the trail of crimson droplets leading to the open window. They stopped abruptly at the sill, as if he'd been yanked into the night. A strangled cry erupted from the hallway behind me, followed by a cacophony of crashing and shattering glass. It was Kelly. I bolted out of the room, my pulse roaring in my ears. Her door was closed, but something heavy slammed against it from the inside, rattling the frame. Kelly! Kelly! I shouted, pounding on the door. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a low guttural noise that raised every hair on my body. It wasn't human. I stumbled back, and the door creaked open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness within. Kelly? My voice quivered. I took a tentative step forward, my hand reaching for the light switch. The bulb flickered weakly, casting erratic shadows across the room. The bed was empty, the sheets in disarray. The walls were smeared with handprints, the same dark red as the trail I'd seen in Jake's room. They seemed to form a pattern, spiraling toward the ceiling. And then I saw it. Her reflection in the cracked mirror above the dresser. Kelly stood behind me. But when I turned, the room was empty. The reflection didn't move. Her face twisted in an expression of terror and agony, her mouth open in a silent scream. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of the dresser, sending me sprawling to the floor. The mirror shattered, its shards raining down around me. The pieces reflected dozens of faces, all twisted and wrong, their eyes black voids that seemed to pull at my very soul. I crawled backward, my hands scraping against the splintered floorboards. The faces vanished as suddenly as they'd appeared, leaving only my own wide-eyed reflection staring back from a shard. I didn't wait for whatever came next. Iuba, devil, ducks. I fled, sprinting down the hallway towards Sandra's room. Her door was open, swinging on its hinges. And the room was in chaos. Furniture overturned, the windows smashed inward as if something had forced its way inside. But Sandra was nowhere to be seen. Panic clawed at my throat. They were gone, all of them, and I was alone in this cursed place. Or so I thought. As I turned to leave, a shadow detached itself from the corner of the room, moving with unnatural fluidity. It stretched impossibly long, its edges fraying like smoke. A voice whispered in my ear, low and mocking, though no one was there. You should have stayed away. I ran, my feet pounding down the stairs. The lobby was a maze of shadows, the front door barely visible through the darkness that seemed to writhe and pulse like a living thing. My hand grasped the handle, yanking it open with a strength born of desperation. The air outside was no better. The town was alive with whispers, the wind carrying fragmented voices that spoke of things I didn't want to understand. Shapes moved in the periphery of my vision, always just out of sight. The gas station loomed ahead, its flickering neon sign casting a sickly green glow. Shio! Tai! Tai! I didn't care what waited for me there. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. The night outside was thick and oppressive, like a smothering fog that seeped into my skin. Every nerve in my body was on edge as I sprinted toward the gas station, its distant light flickering like a beacon. My feet slapped against the cracked pavement, the sound swallowed by the eerie silence that had overtaken the town. The whispers followed me. They weren't carried on the wind anymore. They were inside my head, an endless stream of incoherent murmurs that scratched at my sanity. My breathing was ragged, each gasp burning my lungs as I pushed myself harder. I didn't dare look behind me. I could feel it, the presence, a weight pressing against the back of my neck, urging me to turn around. But I wouldn't. I couldn't. The gas station loomed closer, its neon sign flickering erratically. The buzzing sound of the fluorescent lights greeted me as I stumbled into the parking lot. And I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the handle. The station was eerily quiet, its windows dark, despite the sign's weak glow. I glanced back at the street, expecting to see something, but the road was empty, stretching into the void of the night. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open. The bell above jingled faintly, the sound unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. Inside, the air was stale and thick, with the metallic tang of rust. The shelves were sparsely stocked, their contents coated in a layer of dust. My eyes darted to the counter, where an old radio sat crackling with static. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, almost childlike. There was no answer. I moved toward the counter, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The radio hissed louder as I approached, the static morphing into fragmented voices. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of the words. "Run. Don't look behind." A chill ran down my spine, and I straightened abruptly, the blood pounding in my ears. The air around me seemed to thicken, growing heavier with each passing second. I turned, scanning the store. At first, I saw nothing but shadow and decay. But then, in the corner near the refrigerators, something shifted. A figure stood there, barely visible in the dim light. Its outline was blurred, as if it didn't quite belong in this reality. It moved toward me with a jerky, unnatural gait, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. I backed away, my legs trembling, but my body collided with the counter. The thing stopped just short of the light, its face obscured by darkness. "Who? What are you?" My voice cracked, but it didn't answer. Instead, it reached out, its hand impossibly long and thin, the fingers tipped with claws that glinted in the faint light. The whispers in my head grew louder, almost deafening. They weren't just voices anymore. They were images, memories, fears I hadn't even realized I'd buried. I ducked under the counter as the thing lunged. "Hello." My hands fumbled for anything I could use as a weapon. My fingers closed around a rusted tire iron, and I swung blindly. The impact was jarring, but when I looked up, the figure was gone. Only the faint impression of its clawed hand remained on the counter, burned into the surface like a brand. I didn't wait to see if it would return. Clutching the tire iron, I bolted out the door and into the night. The whispers followed, more insistent now, their tone accusatory. The streets seemed to twist and shift as I ran, the familiar layout of the town becoming a labyrinth of dead ends and crumbling buildings. I found myself in front of the diner. Its windows were shattered, the neon sign above it flickering Weakly, I hesitated, but the sound of footsteps behind me forced me forward. I pushed through the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The diner was worse than the gas station. Holy, anyway, one clustered teddy, two failed inane, stool. The booths were overturned. The floor slick with something dark and sticky. The smell of decay was overwhelming. My stomach churned as I stepped further inside. The jukebox in the corner emitted a low, distorted hum. The melody warped and unrecognizable. Jake, Kelly, Sandra, their names left my lips before I could stop myself. My voice echoed in the emptiness, mocking me. And then, from the kitchen, came a sound, a wet, dragging noise that sent a jolt of fear through my entire being. I approached the kitchen door, every step a battle against the terror threatening to consume me. The dragging noise grew louder, accompanied by a faint, wet gurgling. My hand shook as I pushed the door open. Inside, the scene was worse than I could have imagined. The walls were smeared with dark, arterial streaks, the tiles slick with blood. In the center of the room, something was moving, shifting and writhing like a mass of flesh and shadows. It turned toward me, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could comprehend. Its form defied logic, a shifting amalgamation of limbs and faces, all distorted and wrong. The faces were familiar. Jake's, Kelly's, Sandra's, twisting and screaming silently as they melted into the grotesque mass. The whispers became a roar, a cacophony of voices, demanding, pleading, accusing. My grip on the tire iron tightened, but I knew it was useless. The thing surged toward me, and I did the only thing I could. I ran. The air outside the diner was colder now, biting against my skin like tiny needles. I stumbled onto the cracked pavement, the grotesque images of what I had seen still clawing at my mind. My legs felt heavy, as though they were wading through an unseen tide that resisted my every step. I clung to the tire iron, as if it were the only thing tethering me to reality. The shadows seemed alive, writhing and stretching with every flicker of the sparse streetlights. The whispers were louder now, no longer just a murmur at the edge of my senses. Though they were clearer, sharper, like voices just behind me. They spoke my name, each syllable dripping with malice. I couldn't take it anymore. I spun around, brandishing the tire iron wildly, but there was nothing. Only the empty street, silent and vast, stretching into an abyss of darkness. My heart raced as I turned back toward Main Street. I needed to find someone, anyone, but the town was deserted. Storefronts that had once been bustling with life were now darkened shells, their windows shattered and their signs swinging gently in the wind. It was as if the town had been abandoned for years, not hours. The unsettling silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the occasional creak of metal or the distant sound of something skittering just out of sight. I kept walking, my footsteps the only sound grounding me in the moment. The tire iron felt useless in my hands, more like a talisman than a weapon. A flickering light caught my attention ahead. It was the old movie theater. Its once vibrant marquee now hung precariously, its letters scattered on the ground like discarded bones. The faint glow of its sign pulsed weakly, casting an eerie light over the entrance. The whispers seemed to urge me toward it, an unrelenting pull that I couldn't resist. My breath quickened as I approached the double doors, one of which dangled from its hinges. The lobby was dimly lit. The once red carpet faded to a dull, mottled brown. Posters for films long forgotten lined the walls, their faces warped and peeling. I hesitated, glancing back at the empty street, but there was no turning back. Something had drawn me here, and I couldn't leave without understanding why. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic. The concession stand stood abandoned, its glass display shattered. The popcorn machine had long since decayed, its contents reduced to a blackened, unrecognizable sludge. The whispers grew louder as I ventured deeper into the theater, their tones shifting from accusatory to pleading, as if they were warning me. The main auditorium was vast and shrouded in shadow. The seats were torn and scattered, some overturned, others missing entirely. At the far end, the screen loomed like a monolith, cracked and stained with dark streaks. A faint humming sound filled the room, vibrating in my chest. I approached cautiously, my eyes darting around for any sign of movement. As I neared the stage, the humming intensified, transforming into a low, resonant thrum that seemed to emanate from the screen itself. And then I saw it, a faint image flickering across the tattered surface. It was distorted, a kaleidoscope of light and shadow that coalesced into something resembling a face. But it wasn't just one face. It was many, all shifting and blending together in a grotesque dance. The voices in my head reached a crescendo, and suddenly the image on the screen froze. A single face stared back at me, its eyes hollow and unseeing, its mouth twisted into an expression of anguish. My blood ran cold as I realized it was my own face. My hands trembled and the tire iron slipped from my grip, clattering to the ground with a deafening echo. The screen began to pulse, the face growing larger, more defined. The shadows in the room moved unnaturally, converging toward me. I backed away, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The air grew colder, each breath forming a cloud of condensation that hung in the stillness. And then it spoke, not in whispers, but in a voice that was deep and guttural, reverberating through the theater. "Why did you come back?" The question sent a wave of terror through me, my knees buckling under its weight. I tried to respond, but my voice caught in my throat. The face on the screen twisted, the hollow eyes narrowing, as if waiting for an answer. I didn't mean to," I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. The screen crackled, and the image distorted again, the face melting into a swirling vortex of shadows and light. The room began to shake, the seats rattling and the walls groaning as if under immense pressure. A deafening roar filled the space, drowning out the voices and my own panicked thoughts. I turned and ran, tripping over the scattered debris as I scrambled for the exit. The theater seemed to stretch endlessly, the doors impossibly far away. The shadows chased me, their forms indistinct but menacing, their presence a suffocating weight that pressed against my chest. When I finally burst through the doors and into the night, the world outside had changed. The streets were shrouded in a thick fog, the buildings distorted and shifting as if caught in a mirage. The whispers were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that was somehow worse. I stumbled to the ground, gasping for air, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I didn't know where to go. The town was no longer familiar, its landmarks twisted and unrecognizable. The only constant was the overwhelming sense that I was being watched, hunted. The theater loomed behind me, its broken marquee casting a faint, flickering glow that barely penetrated the fog. And then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound, like footsteps approaching from the darkness. The footsteps echoed in the fog, growing louder with every passing second. Each step seemed deliberate, heavy, and unrelenting, as though whoever, or whatever, was approaching knew I had nowhere to hide. My pulse raced, pounding in my ears as I forced myself to my feet. The tire iron was still in my hand, its cold weight a fragile comfort. The fog parted slightly, just enough to reveal a silhouette. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to stretch and bend at impossible angles. Its head tilted to the side, studying me like a predator, assessing its prey. The figure didn't move, but the oppressive feeling of its gaze was enough to root me to the spot. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body betrayed me. Frozen in terror, the figure raised an arm, impossibly long and thin, and pointed toward the theater behind me. It wanted me to go back inside. I shook my head, muttering under my breath, "No, no way." My voice was hoarse, barely audible over the pounding in my chest. Ah. The figure took a step closer, the sound of its movement sending a shiver down my spine. Its features became clearer, a face that wasn't entirely human, with eyes that glowed faintly, like embers in the darkness. Its mouth twisted into what might have been a grin, though there was no comfort in its expression. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a loose piece of asphalt. I hit the ground hard, the tire iron slipping from my grasp and clattering against the pavement. The sound echoed unnaturally, reverberating through the stillness like a gunshot. The figure stopped, lowering its arm, and for a brief moment I thought it might leave me alone. But then it lunged. The distance between us closed in an instant, faster than my mind could process. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline surging through me as I bolted into the fog. The world around me blurred, shapes and shadows twisting in my peripheral vision. My lungs burned, my legs screaming with every step. But I didn't dare stop. The figure's presence was palpable, its steps thunderous behind me, closing the gap with horrifying ease. I turned sharply into an alley, barely registering the graffiti-covered walls and the dumpsters overflowing with rotting garbage. Dumpsters overflowing with rotting garbage. The stench was overwhelming, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was escaping. The alley ended in a high chain-link fence, the kind meant to keep people out, or trap them in. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I threw myself at the fence, clawing my way up, the metal biting into my hands. The figure's shadow loomed at the mouth of the alley, its form distorted and writhing. I reached the top of the fence and threw myself over, landing hard on the other side. Pain shot through my ankle, but I forced myself to keep moving. I stumbled into a narrow street lined with abandoned buildings, their windows shattered and their facades crumbling. The place was eerily silent, as though it had been forgotten by the world. I ducked into one of the buildings, slamming the door shut behind me and leaning against it, struggling to catch my breath. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the streetlights outside. My heart was still racing, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any sign of pursuit. Silence. For the first time since stepping into that cursed theater, I allowed myself to hope that I was safe. But the stillness of the room was unsettling. It felt wrong. I turned slowly, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The space was small, cluttered with old furniture and stacks of yellowed newspapers. A faint smell of decay lingered in the air. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, a mirror stood propped against the wall. Its surface was cracked, the fractures forming an intricate web that distorted the reflection. But what made my blood run cold was the figure standing in the mirror's reflection. It wasn't me. It was the thing from the alley, its twisted grin frozen in place as it stared directly at me. Its glowing eyes bored into mine, and I could feel its malice as if it were a physical weight pressing down on me. My breath hitched, and I stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of newspapers. The sound broke the stillness, and the figure in the mirror tilted its head, mimicking my earlier movement. I turned to look at the corner, but there was nothing there. The mirror was empty. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and pale, but there was no sign of the creature. I approached the mirror cautiously, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch its surface. It was cold, unnaturally so, and the fractures seemed to pulse faintly beneath my fingertips. And then the glass rippled, like water disturbed by a single drop. My reflection vanished, replaced by a swirling void that seemed to stretch infinitely. I tried to pull my hand away, but it was stuck, as though the glass had turned to tar. Panic surged through me as the void began to pull, dragging me closer. No, I screamed, using my free hand to grab the edge of the mirror, trying to anchor myself. The pull was relentless, and the world around me began to blur and distort. Shadows swirled in the void, forming shapes and faces that were hauntingly familiar. They were people I knew, or had known, friends, family, strangers I'd passed on the street. All of them stared at me with empty eyes, their mouths moving soundlessly. The mirror's pull grew stronger, and I felt myself slipping. My reflection reappeared in the void, but it wasn't me. It was the thing from the alley. Its grin wider now, its eyes glowing brighter. It raised a hand, mirroring my own movements, and placed it against the other side of the glass. The surface grew warm under my touch, and the shadows behind the figure seemed to pulse with life. And then the glass shattered. The moment the glass shattered, the air itself seemed to tremble, reverberating with an unearthly resonance. Jagged shards spiraled outward, hanging motionless in the air for an unnatural beat, before falling to the ground in an eerie, synchronized cacophony. I staggered back, instinctively raising my arms to shield my face. When the last fragment clattered to the floor, an oppressive silence settled over the room, thick and suffocating. The mirror was gone. In its place was a gaping void, a swirling mass of darkness and light that seemed alive, pulsating like a heartbeat. It was impossible to look directly at it for more than a few seconds. And my mind recoiled, struggling to make sense of the impossible. Yet, as much as I wanted to run, I couldn't move. The void held me in its grasp, a magnet for my terror. From deep within the vortex, a shape began to emerge. It was indistinct at first, a shadow bleeding into reality. But as it stepped forward, its form solidified. It was the figure, the thing that had been chasing me. It towered above me, its presence filling the room with a suffocating dread. This close, I could see the details of its face, or what should have been a face. It was a grotesque imitation of humanity, a patchwork of features stitched together by malice. Its glowing eyes bore into mine, and for the first time, it spoke. The voice was a symphony of whispers, each word layered with echoes that seemed to crawl beneath my skin. "You cannot escape," it said, its tone devoid of emotion, but heavy with finality. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall with a dull thud. My breath came in ragged gasps as I frantically searched for something, anything, that could help me. My eyes fell on the tire iron still lying on the floor, a dull glint in the dim light. Without thinking, I lunged for it, my fingers curling around the cold metal. The figure didn't move, but its presence grew heavier, pressing down on me like a physical force. "Stay back," I shouted, brandishing the tire iron like it was some kind of talisman. My voice was shaky, the fear bleeding through every word. The figure tilted its head, almost mockingly, before taking a deliberate step forward. I swung the tire iron with all my strength, aiming for its head. The metal connected, but instead of resistance, there was nothing. The figure dissolved into smoke, swirling around me before reforming behind me. Its laughter, low and guttural, reverberated through the room, each note a dagger to my sanity. Before I could turn, its hand shot out, gripping my wrist with an inhuman strength. Pain shot up my arm as its fingers dug into my skin, cold as death. I dropped the tire iron, and it clattered uselessly to the floor. The figure leaned closer, its face mere inches from mine. "This is not your world anymore," it whispered. And then I was falling. The room dissolved around me, the floor giving way to an endless void. I tumbled through the darkness, weightless and directionless, the air rushing past me in a deafening roar. The figure's laughter followed me, growing louder and louder, until it was all I could hear. Just when I thought I would fall forever, I hit something solid. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I lay there, gasping for air. The surface beneath me was cold and smooth, like polished stone. Slowly, I pushed myself up, my muscles trembling from the effort. The darkness receded slightly, revealing a vast expanse of black marble stretching infinitely in all directions. Above me, the void churned, its edges writhing like living tendrils. I wasn't alone. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, their forms flickering like static. Some were human, or had been at one point, but others defied explanation. They moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm, their eyes glowing faintly like the figure that had chased me. They surrounded me, their whispers filling the air with a chaotic symphony of voices. Each one was distinct, yet they blended together, an incoherent cacophony that made my head spin. One of them stepped forward, its movements smoother than the others. Its face was obscured, but its voice was unmistakable. It was mine. "You brought this upon yourself," it said, its tone dripping with accusation. "What do you mean?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "I didn't." The figure cut me off, its laugh cold and hollow. "You opened the door," it said, gesturing to the void above us. Elna, gesturing to the void. "And now you will see what lies beyond." Before I could respond, the figures surged forward, their hands clawing at me, pulling me down. The ground beneath me shifted, the marble cracking and splitting apart. I struggled against their grip, but there were too many of them. Their whispers grew louder, drilling into my mind, eroding my thoughts. Just as the ground gave way completely, plunging me into darkness once more, one word rose above the chaos, spoken in my own voice. Forever. The descent into darkness wasn't a fall, but a slow, deliberate pull. The sensation of weightlessness gave way to something far worse, a crushing pressure, as if the air itself sought to compress me into nothingness. I couldn't see anything, but I felt the presence of countless eyes watching, their gaze burning through me. I was exposed, vulnerable, and utterly powerless. When I finally hit solid ground again, it wasn't with a thud but a strange, muffled stillness, as though the world itself absorbed the sound. The surface was soft, yet unyielding, like flesh stretched taut over stone. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering in my chest, and looked around. This place. It wasn't like the void I had seen before. The walls seemed alive, pulsating faintly as if breathing. Vines of crimson light pulsed through the surface, casting eerie, shifting patterns across the ground. It felt alive. Every step I took echoed, the sound bouncing back with an almost mocking cadence. And then I heard it, a voice, soft and serpentine, whispering my name. It came from everywhere and nowhere, wrapping around me like a cold embrace. I turned in every direction, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice breaking. The whisper didn't answer. Instead, it grew louder, splitting into multiple voices, all overlapping, all calling my name. Panic surged through me, and I ran. The corridor stretched endlessly, its walls narrowing and expanding with every step. It was as if the place itself was alive, toying with me. The voices followed, growing more insistent, more accusatory. Each one spoke fragments of thoughts I hadn't dared to admit to myself. Fears, regrets, moments of weakness. They knew everything. "You think you can escape?" One voice hissed, "This is your fault." Another growled, "You brought us here." A third one whispered, dripping with venom, "No." "Eerie," I shouted, my voice cracking. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But my words felt hollow, powerless, against the weight of the truth bearing down on me. Deep down, I knew they were right. This was my fault. Taylor. I had opened the door. Heck had opened the door. I had let them in. I didn't stop running until I reached a massive chamber. It was circular, the ceiling disappearing into a swirling void of light and darkness. In the center stood an altar, and on it lay an object that shouldn't have existed, a mirror. It was cracked, the fractures spreading like spiderwebs across its surface. But even in its broken state, it pulsed with a strange, hypnotic light. Against my better judgment, I approached it. The whispers fell silent. As I drew closer, replaced by a low rhythmic hum that seemed to come from the mirror itself, my reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't right. The eyes were too dark, the smile too sharp. It was me, but it wasn't me. The reflection raised its hand, beckoning me closer, its movements unnervingly slow and deliberate. "Don't," I whispered to myself, but my body didn't listen. My hand moved on its own, reaching out to touch the glass. The moment my fingers made contact, a shockwave of cold shot through me, freezing me in place. The reflection's smile widened, splitting its face almost in two. And then it spoke. "You've come so far," it said, its voice dripping with mockery. "But you've always known where this would end." I tried to pull my hand away, but I couldn't move. The mirror began to pull me in, its surface rippling like water. My reflection stepped forward, merging with me. Pain seared through my body as if I were being torn apart and stitched back together simultaneously. Memories that weren't mine flooded my mind. Visions of unspeakable horrors, endless darkness, and the faces of those I had wronged. When the pain subsided, I was no longer standing in the chamber. "Me, too. Call, Tizuvana, Gnai, Cantos." I was back in the house, the place where it had all begun. But something was wrong. The walls were too tall, the shadows too deep. The air buzzed with an unnatural energy, and the house felt alive. And then I saw them. Figures from the void stood in the shadows, their glowing eyes fixed on me. They were waiting, their silence more terrifying than their whispers. One by one they stepped forward, surrounding me. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. I was trapped, paralyzed, as they closed in. The last thing I saw was my reflection, standing among them, its grin wider than ever. It raised a hand, and with a single motion, everything went black. In that final moment, I understood. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Moi, Thames, Howl, a cycle, unbroken and eternal, and I was part of it now. The first time I stepped onto Whispering Ridge, the air was unnaturally still, as though the entire forest had collectively held its breath. I parked my car just before the broken barrier, the last physical sign of the town's unwillingness to acknowledge this place. A rusted warning sign dangled by one bolt, swaying slightly, even though there was no wind. "Keep out. Road unsafe." Its faint creak was the only sound accompanying me. As I stepped onto the cracked pavement, the soles of my boots crunching against shards of loose gravel, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Hewtadif, Noah, Situdei. It wasn't the peaceful kind that comes with isolation. This was oppressive. A void that swallowed every small sound I made. Even my own breathing seemed muted. Shadows danced unnaturally between the towering pines, their gnarled branches arching over the road like skeletal hands. It felt as if they were reaching for me, eager to pull me into their depths. I walked with my flashlight, its beam cutting through the thick mist that clung to the ground like a living thing. The reports about this road had been vague, the kind of whispers passed down through generations. Missing hikers. Al Ilvis Subi Efsain. Abandoned cars. Faint cries in the night. Deum Tulul Tul. Each account had ended the same way, and no one ever found them again. The road seemed endless. And every step felt like I was moving deeper into something I couldn't define. A place that wasn't meant to be found. My stomach churned, though I wasn't sure if it was fear or the way the air seemed thick enough to choke on. Then I saw it. The first sign that I wasn't alone. A single sneaker sat on the edge of the road, its fabric soaked and darkened with moisture. It was child-sized, far too small to belong to the hiker whose case had led me here. My chest tightened, my flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. As I scanned the surrounding area, there was no sound of movement, no rustle of leaves or snapping of twigs. And just that overwhelming silence, pressing down on me like a lead weight. I crouched to inspect the shoe, noticing the way it seemed oddly clean, despite the damp and decay surrounding it. That's when I saw the footprint, a single, bare print in the mud leading toward the tree line. The size was wrong again. Small, delicate, a child's. I should have turned back. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to leave this cursed place behind. But I was driven by something stronger than fear. Curiosity laced with a stubborn determination to uncover the truth. I followed the print into the woods, leaving the relative safety of the road behind. My flashlight flickered briefly, and my breath caught as the shadows seemed to shift and writhe, creating shapes that shouldn't have been there. Then I heard it, a faint giggle, high-pitched and distant, like the laughter of a child playing hide-and-seek. It wasn't playful, though. It was mocking, laced with an undertone that made my skin crawl. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the trees. I froze, my heart pounding so violently it felt as though it might burst from my chest. The laughter faded into a whisper, unintelligible and yet horrifyingly clear. My feet moved on their own, slow and deliberate, as if I were no longer in control of my own body. The flashlight beam shook as I aimed it toward the source of the sound, my breath fogging in the icy air. What I saw made my blood run cold. A figure stood just beyond the reach of the light, small, frail, and motionless. It was a child, their back turned to me. The hair on the back of my neck bristled as I called out. No response. As I stepped closer, the details became clearer. The child wore a tattered dress, its fabric hanging in damp, frayed ribbons. Something about the stillness of their posture made the world tilt slightly, as if gravity had shifted around them. I reached out a trembling hand, not sure why I felt compelled to make contact. The moment my fingers brushed their shoulder, they spun around, and I stumbled backward, choking on a scream that barely escaped my throat. The face wasn't human, Hollow sockets stared back at me, black as the void that surrounded this place. The skin was pale and waxy, stretched too tight over sharp angles that didn't belong on a child. A grin, impossibly wide and filled with jagged teeth, split their face, and that terrible giggle filled the air again, louder now, reverberating through my skull. I don't remember running. One moment I was frozen in terror, and the next I was sprinting back toward the road, branches tearing at my skin and mist clawing at my legs like ghostly hands. The laughter followed me, growing fainter as I stumbled back onto the cracked pavement, gasping for air. When I reached my car, it was wrong. The windows were shattered, and deep claw marks raked across the hood. My hands shook as I fumbled for my keys, my thoughts racing with the realization that I was no longer alone. As the engine roared to life, I glanced back at the road one last time. The Veer stood there, perfectly still, their hollow eyes locked onto me as I sped away. Their grin never wavered, even as the mist swallowed them whole. The drive away from Whispering Ridge was a blur of headlights and adrenaline, the trees on either side of the road melting into dark streaks as I pushed the car faster than I'd ever dared. My hands clutched the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, and my heart hammered in my chest like a war drum. I couldn't shake the memory of that face, the grin that felt like it had carved itself into my mind. It was as if the thing I'd seen wasn't just behind me, but inside me, its hollow gaze burrowing into my soul. I didn't stop driving until I reached the safety of my driveway, the familiar sight of my small house, its porch light casting a warm glow in the encroaching darkness, should have calmed me. Instead, it felt alien, like I was returning to a world that no longer belonged to me. My trembling fingers fumbled with the keys as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, slamming it shut behind me. The silence in my home wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, pressing down on me like the weight of the forest. Eagerly missed, I double-checked the locks, drawing every curtain and flipping on every light, as if the brightness could banish the lingering dread. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I paced the living room, my breathing shallow and uneven. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each sound stretching time into something unbearable. I couldn't stop replaying the events in my mind, searching for some rational explanation that would make sense of the nightmare I'd just escaped. But there was no logic in what I'd seen, only the stark, cold reality that something was out there, and it wasn't human. A faint sound broke the silence, freezing me mid-step. Oh, it was a soft tapping, so subtle that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, deliberate and unrelenting. It was coming from the window. Ah, my blood turned to ice. I was Walul. Ice. Slowly, I turned my head toward the source, my pulse roaring in my ears. The curtains were drawn, but the faint outline of something pressed against the glass was unmistakable. It was a hand, small and pale, its fingers splayed wide. The tapping grew more insistent, as if whatever was on the other side knew I was hesitating. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I stepped closer, my feet dragging as if weighted down by Lee. The curtains trembled in the faint draft of my shaky breath. As I reached for them, my fingers brushed the fabric, and I hesitated, the memory of that grin flashing in my mind like a cruel warning, summoning every ounce of courage I didn't feel. I yanked the curtains aside. The window was empty. My reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed, framed by the soft glow of the porch light. The handprint was gone, leaving nothing but a faint smudge on the glass. My chest heaved as I staggered back, every nerve in my body on high alert. The house was silent again, but it was a silence that felt wrong, pregnant with the promise of something waiting, watching. I stumbled toward the kitchen, my hands fumbling for the drawer where I kept a flashlight. The small beam of light felt pitiful against the encroaching darkness. As I swept it across the room, my breath hitching at every shadow, I had to check the house. I had to know I was alone. The living room was empty. The bathroom, the bedroom, the closets, nothing out of place. But the feeling of unease grew stronger with every step, like an invisible thread tightening around me. It wasn't until I reached the hallway leading to the basement that I felt the full weight of something staring back at me. The door was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it yawning like an open mouth. A faint, rhythmic creak echoed up the stairs, the sound of something swaying gently in the void. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I pointed it toward the opening, the beam barely penetrating the shadows. "Hello." The word barely escaped my lips, a whisper swallowed by the void. The creaking stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against my ears until I thought I might scream just to break it. Then, slowly, the door began to close, not with a slam, but a deliberate, excruciating slowness that made my stomach churn. I took a step back, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. The moment the door clicked shut, the lights flickered. Once. Wow. C'est nous decay, et divel. Shush, two. Twice. Oh. Amen. Foray. And then they went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. I wasn't alone. I knew it with a certainty that burned in my chest like a live wire. The air around me seemed to hum with a presence, an unseen force that crawled along my skin. My flashlight flickered to life just as something brushed past me, cold and fleeting. I spun around, the beam dancing wildly across the room. But there was nothing there. The tapping returned, louder now, echoing from every window, every wall. It was joined by whispers, faint and unintelligible, swirling around me like a storm. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness alive with shapes that melted away as soon as I tried to focus on them. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The house was silent again, but the silence was heavier than before, as if it were holding its breath. The flashlight flickered one last time before dying completely, leaving me alone in the suffocating darkness. That's when I felt it, a hand, impossibly cold, closing around my wrist. The hand gripping my wrist was icy, its touch searing my skin with a sensation that felt unnatural. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't pull away, couldn't move. It held me in place, its grip firm yet weightless, as if it weren't tethered to anything substantial. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, the darkness yawning open like an abyss, swallowing any semblance of familiarity. When I finally managed to shine the flashlight in its direction, the beam revealed nothing, just empty air where the grip should have been. Yet the pressure on my wrist remained, solid and unyielding, a cruel phantom mocking my senses. My legs trembled as I backed away, dragging the unseen force with me until, mercifully, it let go. The air in the house had changed, thick and oppressive, like it had been sucked of all oxygen. I stumbled into the living room, the flashlight casting erratic patterns across the walls. My mind raced, grasping for logic that didn't exist. There was no explanation for this, no rational answer that could ground me in reality. A noise shattered the suffocating silence. The faint creak of a floorboard upstairs. It was slow, deliberate, each step drawing closer to the top of the staircase. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run. But my body betrayed me. My feet stayed planted, as if the fear had rooted me in place. Ambiance. The steps continued, slow and heavy, as though whatever was up there wanted me to know it was coming. I forced myself to move, inching toward the staircase with the flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam jittered across the walls, catching glimpses of the hallway above. Shadows loomed, twisting in unnatural ways as the light flickered. "Who's there?" My voice cracked, the words barely audible against the pounding of my heart. No answer, just the steady rhythm of steps descending, each creak sharper than the last. I raised the flashlight, pointing it toward the top of the stairs. For a moment, there was nothing, just an empty hallway bathed in the weak yellow glow of the beam. But then, a figure appeared. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, its movements smooth and unnatural, as though its feet weren't touching the ground. It was humanoid but wrong, its form shifting subtly, as if it couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. And its face, it was the grin again, that impossible haunting grin that seemed to stretch far beyond the limits of its face. I staggered backward, my knees threatening to give way. The thing didn't follow. It just stood there, at the top of the stairs, staring down at me with those hollow eyes and that grotesque smile. My mind screamed at me to run, to turn and flee, but I couldn't look away. And then it began to move. Not down the stairs, but toward me in an impossible way. One moment at the top, the next right in front of me, its face inches from mine. My scream caught in my throat as the flashlight flickered and died, plunging the house into total darkness. Something cold brushed against my cheek, lingering just long enough to make my skin crawl. I stumbled backward, my hands flailing in the dark, until they found the edge of the couch. I tripped and fell, landing hard on the floor. The wind knocked out of me. The air around me felt alive, vibrating with a low, droning hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I crawled blindly toward the hallway, my hands shaking as they searched for something, anything that could ground me. My fingers grazed the edge of the coffee table and then the wall until I finally found the door to the basement. I didn't want to go down there, but it was the only place left to hide. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound loud and jarring in the otherwise suffocating silence. The basement was pitch black, the darkness so thick it felt like a physical barrier. I slid my hand along the wall, searching for the light switch. But when I found it, I flicked it on, but nothing happened. Behind me, the tapping began again, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the windows this time. It was coming from the walls. I turned, pressing my back against the cold concrete as the noise surrounded me, growing into a cacophony of sound that drowned out everything else. And then it stopped. The silence was worse, deafening and unnatural, as though the house itself were holding its breath. I could feel it now. The thing watching me from the darkness. I didn't need to see it to know it was there, just beyond the edge of my perception, waiting for me to let my guard down. A faint light flickered to life at the far end of the basement, illuminating a door I didn't recognize. It was old, its wooden frame warped and splintered, as though it had been there for decades, hidden beneath the foundation. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward it, despite the primal fear screaming at me to turn back. The door creaked open before I could reach it, revealing a staircase that spiraled downward into the earth. A faint, sickly glow emanated from below, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. The air that wafted up was cold and damp, carrying with it a faint metallic smell that made my stomach turn. I stood at the threshold, staring down into the unknown. Every fiber of my being told me not to go, that whatever was down there wasn't meant to be found, but I couldn't ignore the pull, the inexplicable urge to descend into the depths. With a shaky breath, I took the first step. The creak of the wooden stair echoed around me, followed by another, and then another, until the basement and the world above were nothing more than a distant memory. Descending those ancient stairs felt like stepping into another world, one that time and reason had abandoned. The deeper I went, the colder it became. The walls damp with moisture that seemed to seep from the very bones of the earth. That metallic tang in the air grew stronger, filling my nostrils with each shaky breath. The faint glow at the bottom of the staircase pulsed gently, as though it were alive, inviting me further into its grasp. The stairs twisted endlessly, each creak underfoot echoing louder than the last. My flashlight flickered weakly, its beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. Every few steps, I would pause, straining to hear if something or someone was following me. The silence that answered was worse than any sound, a vacuum of nothingness, that pressed down on my chest. Finally, I reached the bottom, where the glow emanated from a doorway carved directly into the stone. Its frame was jagged and uneven, as if it had been clawed out rather than built. Beyond it, the glow revealed a cavernous room that shouldn't have existed beneath the house. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, disappearing into darkness, while the walls glistened with a slick, wet sheen that reflected the pulsing light. At the center of the room stood a table. It wasn't made of wood or stone, but something darker, its surface smooth yet unnervingly organic. The light came from above the table, radiating from an orb that hovered midair, spinning slowly. It cast shifting shadows that played tricks on my eyes, making the room seem alive. Its walls breathing in tandem with the orb's gentle pulsations. Against every rational instinct, I stepped closer. The light from the orb grew brighter with each step, bathing me in its strange, cold glow. My skin prickled as I approached the table, a sensation that wasn't entirely unpleasant, but deeply unsettling. On the table lay objects, personal items, a tarnished locket, a leather-bound journal, and a cracked photograph frame. Each was coated in a fine layer of dust, as though they'd been waiting for someone to notice them. I hesitated, my hand hovering above the locket. The air around it felt heavier, like the room was holding its breath, waiting for me to act. When I finally picked it up, a sharp chill shot through my arm, and the room seemed to lurch around me. My vision blurred, the edges of the cavern melting into indistinct shapes. Then came the whispers. They started softly, just on the edge of hearing, like voices carried on a distant wind. But they grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of overlapping murmurs that I couldn't understand yet, somehow knew were meant for me. The locket grew warmer in my hand, its metal pulsating in rhythm with the orb's light. I opened it. Inside was a photograph of a woman. Her face was serene, her eyes kind, yet there was something off about the image. The longer I stared, the more her features seemed to shift, her expression warping into something sinister. Her eyes, once soft, turned sharp and accusing, as if she were looking directly at me, through me. I dropped the locket, the sound of it hitting the table unnaturally loud in the cavernous room. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the walls. My breath came in shallow gasps as I backed away, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. Then the orb moved. It didn't just hover anymore. It began to descend, its light growing more intense, almost blinding. It came to rest just above the table, illuminating the photograph frame and journal. Against my better judgment, I reached for the journal. Hence, the leather was cracked and brittle, its cover adorned with strange symbols that seemed to shift when I looked at them. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was jagged and erratic, scrawled in a language I didn't recognize. Yet, as my eyes traced the lines, I felt a strange understanding creep over me, the words imprinting themselves onto my mind. They weren't instructions. They were warnings, fragmented phrases that spoke of a presence buried deep within the earth, something ancient and restless. The air grew colder, and a new sound joined the growl. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, echoing from the staircase I had just descended. I froze, the journal slipping from my hands as I turned toward the sound. My flashlight flickered again, its beam casting long, exaggerated shadows across the room. A figure emerged at the edge of the light, its form barely human. It was tall and thin, its limbs elongated in unnatural ways. Its face, or what passed for a face, was featureless, save for the eyes, two pinpricks of glowing red that pierced through the darkness. It didn't move like a person. It glided, its body shifting in and out of focus, as though it went fully tethered to this reality. I stumbled backward, colliding with the table. The orb flared, its light intensifying, until it swallowed the room in a blinding white. My vision swam, and I felt the ground beneath me give way. I was falling, weightless, the whispers returning to fill my ears with their relentless murmur. When I hit the ground, the impact drove the air from my lungs. I wasn't in the cavern anymore. I was somewhere else, somewhere impossibly vast and dark, the air thick with the stench of decay. The whispers were louder here, overlapping in a chaotic chorus that threatened to overwhelm my senses. In the distance, a figure stood silhouetted against the faint glow of another orb. It was holding something. A locket identical to the one I had just dropped. As the figure turned, its face came into view. And you, it was mine. The silence pressed against me, so thick it seemed alive, weaving its way around my body, coiling tighter with every passing second. The air was stagnant, heavy with a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. My heart thundered in my chest, each beat louder than the last, echoing in the confines of whatever twisted space I now inhabited. The figure ahead, my mirror image, was motionless, clutching that damned locket in its pale, rigid fingers. The orb behind it flickered erratically, casting harsh shadows that seemed to stretch and curl like living things. I tried to move, but my legs refused to obey. Panic surged through me, sharp and electric, as the figure began to move. It didn't walk. No, it glided toward me, its movements fluid yet somehow fragmented, like a video skipping frames. Its face, identical to mine, wore a frozen expression of eerie calm, but the eyes, those eyes, they burned with a hollow light, devoid of humanity, and locked onto mine as though seeing through to the marrow of my soul. The whispers grew louder, cascading into a chaotic storm of disjointed phrases and distorted syllables. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it was no use. Well, saying, Evsta. The voices weren't just around me. They were inside me, scraping against the walls of my mind. Let it in. Become whole. The words surfaced amidst the noise, clear and sharp, spoken in a voice that sounded like mine, but twisted darker. The ground beneath me shifted, no longer solid, but rippling like water. My balance faltered, and I stumbled forward, landing on my hands and knees. The surface felt cold and wet, but when I looked down, there was no water. It was the same black, shifting substance as the orb, pulsating faintly beneath my trembling palms. A sudden sharp pain bloomed in my chest, and I gasped, clawing at the fabric of my shirt as the sensation intensified. It wasn't physical. It was something deeper, like a thread being pulled taut within me, threatening to snap. The figure was closer now, standing just out of reach, its burning eyes drilling into me. It raised the locket, holding it aloft like an offering, and the whispers grew into a deafening roar. "Take it," the voice commanded. Now, an unrelenting chant that reverberated through the space. "Take it, take it, take it." I shook my head violently, tears streaming down my face as I fought against the command. "No," I screamed, my voice breaking, but it was swallowed by the overwhelming cacophony. My arms trembled under the weight of an invisible force pressing down on me, and my body felt as though it were sinking into the ground. The figure tilted its head, an unnatural, almost curious gesture, and for a moment the whispers stopped. It reached out, its hand impossibly long, fingers curling toward my face. I scrambled backward, my heels slipping against the slick surface. "Aylwer, stay away," I shouted, though I knew it was useless. The thing didn't hesitate. Its fingers grazed my forehead, and an icy wave of energy shot through me, freezing my breath in my lungs. Images flooded my mind, fractured, incomprehensible flashes of a place I couldn't name. Vast, dark expanses filled with shifting shapes, screams echoing through empty corridors, and a presence, vast and malevolent, lurking just beyond the veil of perception. I was pulled back to reality, if this place could be called that, by the sound of my own laughter. It wasn't mine. It came from the figure, its mouth open in an impossibly wide grin that split its face in a grotesque mockery of emotion. The sound was distorted, overlapping with the whispers that had returned. More insistent now. "This is yours. It always was." The orb above us pulsed violently, its light now blinding, and I squeezed my eyes shut against the glare. The air around me shifted again, and when I dared to open my eyes, the figure was gone. The locket lay at my feet, its surface gleaming unnaturally. The whispers had subsided to a low hum, almost soothing in their rhythm. But the absence of the figure brought no relief. The orb's light dimmed, revealing the cavern once more, though now it felt different. It wasn't empty. I became acutely aware of the shadows on the walls, shifting and writhing, their movements no longer tied to the flickering light. Shapes began to form, humanoid but twisted, their features distorted, as though seen through warped glass. They emerged from the walls, their forms stretching and tearing free from the stone, their eyeless faces turning toward me in unison. The locket was in my hand before I realized I'd picked it up. It felt warm now, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. The figures drew closer, their movements slow but deliberate, and the hum of the whispers grew louder, more frantic. "You must choose," the voice in my head said, calm and final. Take your place, or let them take it for you. My mind raced, desperation clawing at the edges of my sanity. The locket seemed to vibrate in my hand, its warmth spreading up my arm. I could feel it calling to me, promising something I couldn't comprehend, but knew I couldn't trust. The figures were mere steps away now, their elongated arms reaching out, fingers tipped with jagged claws. Their mouths, invisible at first, began to split open, revealing rows of glistening teeth. The orb above me pulsed one last time, its light flashing bright enough to make the shadows recoil. For a moment, I was alone again, bathed in its cold glow. The locket burned in my hand, and the voice returned, now whispering softly, almost gently, "You were meant for this. It's already begun." My hand trembled as I raised the locket, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. My reflection shimmered in its surface, warped and distorted like the figures around me. The orb flickered, the cavern shifted, and as I opened the locket once more, the world fractured into a kaleidoscope of impossible shapes and unearthly sounds. Then everything went silent. The silence was worse than the chaos. It pressed in on me, oppressive and endless, leaving room for nothing but the pounding of my heartbeat and the faint echo of my ragged breaths. The locket in my hand was cold now, no longer pulsing, but I could feel its weight in a way that went beyond physicality. It was as though it had anchored itself to my very existence, binding me to this place that was neither entirely real nor completely imaginary. The figures had not disappeared. They had merely retreated to the edges of perception, their forms slipping into the shadows that flickered and danced along the cavern walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching, waiting for some unseen signal. My knees buckled beneath me, and I dropped to the ground, clutching the locket like a lifeline. I needed to think, to make sense of the fractured pieces of reality swirling around me, but my mind refused to cooperate. Every thought felt slippery, dissolving into fragments before I could grasp it. The orb above me pulsed faintly, its light dim and erratic, like the last embers of a dying fire. It illuminated the space just enough for me to see the jagged edges of the cavern and the dark, oily substance that still oozed from the walls. The air was thick with the metallic scent of decay, mingled with something sweeter, almost intoxicating, that made my head spin. I realized with a start that I was no longer alone. A figure emerged from the darkness, its shape more defined than the others, but still raw in ways I couldn't articulate. It walked on elongated legs that bent at unnatural angles, and its arms hung limply at its sides, too long and thin to be human. Its face was featureless, except for a single gaping hole where a mouth should have been. As it approached, the whispers returned, low and insidious, threading their way through my mind like a parasite. I tried to move, to crawl away, but my body refused to respond. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear, or by something more sinister. I couldn't tell. The figure stopped a few feet away, tilting its head as if studying me. From the darkness behind it, more shapes began to emerge, their movements slow and deliberate, their eyeless faces fixed on me. The locket in my hand grew heavier, pulling my arm down until it rested against the cold, slick ground. The whispers intensified, overlapping until they became an unintelligible roar. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it all to stop. But the moment I did, I felt a sharp, burning sensation in my chest. It wasn't pain, not exactly, but it spread quickly, a searing heat that filled me with a sense of overwhelming wrongness. My eyes flew open, and I was met with the sight of my reflection in the locket's surface. But it wasn't me. The face staring back at me was mine, but distorted, twisted into an expression of malice that made my stomach churn. The reflection moved independently, its lips curling into a sneer as it mouthed words I couldn't hear. I tried to let go of the locket, but my fingers wouldn't obey. It clung to me as though fused to my skin, its cold metal digging into my palm. The figure stepped closer, and for the first time, I heard its voice. It wasn't a sound, so much as a feeling, a vibration that resonated through my skull. "You cannot leave," it said, its tone calm but absolute. "You are part of this now. Envelop new tadam shupel ade." "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers. "I didn't choose this." The figure tilted its head again, and I swore. I saw a flicker of amusement in its faceless form. "Choice is an illusion," it said. "You were always meant to be here." Elald. The burning in my chest grew stronger, and I doubled over, clutching at the locket as though it could somehow stop the sensation. The orb above me flared brightly, and the figures surrounding me recoiled, their forms dissolving into the shadows. For a brief moment, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe the light was protecting me. But then, the orb began to descend. It moved slowly, deliberately, until it hovered just above my head. Its light was no longer warm or inviting. It was cold and sharp, cutting through me with an intensity that left me gasping. The whispers had stopped again, replaced by a single voice that echoed through the cavern. It was the same voice that had spoken to me before, but now it sounded closer, more intimate. "You belong to it," it said. "Let it consume you." The orb began to spin, its surface rippling like liquid, as it emitted a low, thrumming sound that reverberated through my bones. The locket in my hand pulsed in time with the sound, its glow matching the rhythm of the orb. I could feel the two objects connected, feeding off each other, and I realized with a sickening certainty that they were drawing power from me. I screamed, a raw, guttural sound that tore through the silence, but it made no difference. The orb continued its descent, and the locket burned hotter in my hand. The figure watched impassively, its head tilted as if in curiosity, and the shadows around it began to writhe and shift, forming shapes that I couldn't comprehend. The last thing I saw before the light consumed me was my own reflection in the orb's surface, distorted, fractured, and utterly unrecognizable. The light didn't fade. It consumed everything. The cavern, the figures, even the locket in my hand. It wasn't blinding, but overwhelming. A brightness that seeped into the cracks of my mind and body until I couldn't distinguish where it ended. And I began. I couldn't feel the ground beneath me, or the weight of my own limbs. It was as though I was suspended in a void, stripped of everything that tethered me to reality. At first, I thought I was dead. The thought was strangely comforting. The pain had stopped, and the oppressive whispers had ceased. But then I heard it again, that voice. Emif Perdikal, Su Kalni, that it was softer now, intimate, like a breath against my ear. You are reborn. The light began to shift, swirling like liquid gold. Shapes emerged from its brilliance. Trees, jagged rocks, a sky stained in hues of crimson and gray. I was no longer in the cavern. Instead, I stood in the middle of a desolate landscape that stretched endlessly in every direction. The air was heavy and warm, laced with the faint scent of burning wood. My legs wobbled beneath me, but they held, and I looked down to see that the locket was still fused to my hand, its surface smooth and unyielding. Ahead of me, a figure waited. It wasn't the same faceless entity from the cavern, but something else entirely. It was tall and gaunt, its body draped in tattered, ash-streaked robes. Its face was pale and angular, with sunken eyes that glowed faintly like embers in a dying fire. When it spoke, its voice echoed with an ancient authority. You have crossed the threshold. I didn't respond. My throat was dry, and my mind raced to make sense of where I was, or what I was. The figure tilted its head, the movement unnervingly familiar, and took a step closer. You feel it, don't you? It said. The bond, it's irreversible now. The locket is no longer a part of you. You are a part of it. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but my body betrayed me. I could only stare as the figure raised a bony hand and pointed toward the horizon. There, in the distance, a tower loomed. Its surface was dark and smooth, reflecting the blood-red sky like a mirror. Tendrils of black mist curled around its base, reaching out like hungry fingers. That is where it ends, the figure said. And where it begins again? Without waiting for a response, it turned and began to walk. I had no choice but to follow. Each step felt heavy, as though the ground itself resisted my movement. But the pull of the locket drove me forward. As we approached the tower, the air grew colder, and the shadows around us deepened, writhing like living things. I could hear faint whispers again, but they were different this time, less intrusive, more inviting. They called my name, soft and pleading, as though begging me to join them. The base of the tower was even more imposing, up close. Its surface was impossibly smooth, devoid of any seams or imperfections. Yet it radiated an energy that made my skin crawl. The figure stopped before an arched doorway that shimmered like liquid glass. It turned to me, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. Beyond this door lies the truth, it said. But truth comes at a cost. Are you prepared to pay it? I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, the locket pulsed in my hand, its rhythm quickening until it matched the frantic beat of my heart. The doorway rippled, and without waiting for my consent, the figure stepped through. The locket burned hotter, pulling me forward, and I stumbled after it. The moment I crossed the threshold, the world shifted again. I was no longer outside the tower. I stood in a room that defied logic, its walls curving and twisting in ways that made my head spin. The air hummed with an electric energy, and in the center of the room stood a pedestal. On it rested a mirror, its surface dark and still, like the calm before a storm. The figure stood beside the pedestal, its form flickering like a weak flame. "This is the heart," it said, its voice softer now, almost reverent. "The locket led you here because you are its vessel, its keeper." I shook my head, finally finding my voice. "I don't want this," I said, my voice trembling. "I never asked for any of this." The figure's glowing eyes dimmed, and for a moment I thought I saw something akin to pity in its expression. "It does not matter what you want," it said. "It only matters what you are." And sternly, before I could respond, the locket pulsed one final time, its light flooding the room. The mirror's surface rippled, and images began to form, fractured glimpses of places I recognized, and others I didn't. I saw myself, but not as I was now. I was smiling, happy, alive. Then the images shifted, showing me things I couldn't comprehend. Endless voids, spiraling galaxies, and a darkness that felt alive, sentient. The locket grew impossibly heavy, and I dropped to my knees, unable to bear its weight any longer. The figure stepped closer, its voice a whisper in my ear. "You are the bridge," it said, "the link between what was and what will be." The mirror's surface shattered, and the pieces flew toward me, embedding themselves in my skin. I screamed as the shards burned, their edges searing into me until I could feel them beneath my flesh. The light dimmed, and the figure's voice was the last thing I heard before everything went dark. "You are not the end. You are the beginning."